When 12-year-old Eli Mercer walked into the Iron Serpent Motorcycle Club clubhouse, everything stopped. The music cut mid-note. A glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered near his shoe. Ellie's hoodie sleeve was dark at the cuff, stiff with dried blood, and his lip was split so badly it had glued itself shut in places. He didn't flint, didn't cry. He just looked at the men leather, scars, engine still ticking from the ride and asked quietly, "If I sleep here tonight, will you wake me if someone comes?" No one answered, but something in that room shifted slow, irreversible like a door closing behind them all. This was a place where rules mattered. They weren't written anywhere, but everyone knew them. No phones, no outsiders, no kids. The Iron Serpent clubhouse breathed like a machine at rest alive, but barely. The smell hit first. Old oil soaked into concrete, burnt coffee left along on a warmer. The metallic tang of engines that had been shut down only minutes ago. Beneath it all lingered the faint bite of cigarette smoke, stale and stubborn, clinging to the walls like a memory no one bothered to erase. A truck thundered past outside, and the walls answered with a low vibration, the fluorescent light above flickering in response. It buzzed unevenly, as if deciding whether it wanted to stay on. 8 bikes were parked out front, 8 men inside. Leather creaked when someone shifted their weight. A knuckle wrap once absent-minded against the edge of a scarred wooden table. Someone exhaled through their nose, slow and controlled. The room had gone quiet, but not still. It was the kind of quiet that leaned forward, listening. The boy stood just inside the door. He hadn't taken another step since he'd spoken. He stayed close to the exit without touching it, like he wasn't sure if it might disappear. His sneakers were soaked through at the toe, leaving faint, dark half-moons on the concrete. One of his hands was shoved deep into the pocket of his hoodie, gripping something maybe nothing at all. No one told him to sit. No one told him to leave. That was worse. Every man in the room was bigger than him. Wider shoulders, heavier boots, faces shaped by years of wind and sun and choices that didn't ask permission. Some wore cuts with patches stitched thick and proud. Others had stripped theirs off, sleeves rolled up, scars exposed without apology. They didn't stare outright. They didn't need to. Their leader sat at the far end of the room, in a chair that wasn't special except that no one else ever used it. Marcus Gravel King leaned back, one arm resting on the table, fingers loose. His hair was threaded with gray, his beard trimmed short, his eyes steady in a way that made people uncomfortable when they talked too much. He didn't rise, didn't speak. He just watched the boy the way you watched a fuse after striking a match, waiting to see how fast it would burn. The boy shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His gaze moved in fragments. The door, the floor, a dent in the wall shaped like an old punch. He avoided the table, avoided the patches, avoided Gravel's eyes altogether. Kids didn't belong here. This place had seen blood, but not panic, anger, but not fear like this. Fear this small had no defenses. It had nowhere to hide, especially kids like him, thin, as if he'd learned how to make himself take up less space. Shoulders drawn in, chin lifted just enough to pretend he wasn't afraid. Eyes that didn't move like a child should. Eyes that measured exits before faces. Someone cleared their throat, then thought better of it. Another man glanced at the clock on the wall. Though time didn't mean much in a room like this, the boy waited. He didn't ask again. That might have been the thing that unsettled them most. No one asked his name. Not yet, because names made things real. And once something was real, you had to decide what to do with it. The door behind him stayed closed. Gravel noticed the bruise first, not the one everyone else would have seen. The dark bloom under the boy's eye, still raw, still angry, but the softer color beneath it, yellow edging into green. A bruise that had already lived a few days, long enough to start healing, long enough to have happened and been ignored. Gravel's gaze didn't linger. He'd learned a long time ago that staring made people shut down. Instead, he let his eyes drift back to the table, fingers tapping once against the wood, slow and steady. "Who did that to you?" he asked. His voice didn't rise, didn't soften either. It landed in the space between, neutral enough to feel safe, firm enough to mean he wasn't joking. Eli shrugged. It wasn't dramatic, just a small lift of one shoulder, like the question hadn't reached him properly, like it had brushed past something harder. Kids who've learned not to trust adults always do that. They keep answers loose, easy to drop. Across the room, someone shifted. Leather whispered. A man near the wall muttered, almost to himself, "Was it a fight?" Eli shook his head once, sharp. Final. No explanation followed. The silence stretched thin and taut. Gravel waited. He didn't feel it. He knew silence had weight. If you let it sit long enough, people either walked away from it or told you something true. Ellie's eyes fixed on a dark stain on the concrete floor. Oil, maybe, or something older. His fingers flexed at his side, opening and closing like he was testing whether they still worked. "My dad used to wake me," he said. The words came out of nowhere, cutting across the room like a drop tool. Not loud, just sudden. Gravel looked up, but he didn't interrupt. Eli swallowed and went on, voice low, uneven. "Even if I was pretending to sleep, he'd say my name real quiet, just in case." One of the men at the table stilled completely. Another looked away. "He died last winter," Eli said. Hard. Just stop. He mimed it without realizing. One hand clenched into a fist, then went slack. A paw. The kind that wasn't empty. The kind that carried weather in it. "Mom says I'm old enough now," Eli added. His tone flattened, like he was reciting something he'd heard too many times. "Says if I get hit, it's cause I don't listen good." Gravel felt something tighten behind his ribs. Ellie's hands clenched, unclenched. The movement was quick, automatic. A reflex learned the hard way. She gets real quiet before door. Eli said, "That's how I know. No one asked what before meant. They didn't need to. I ran today," Eli said, finally lifting his eyes, not to Gravel, to the door, because she said next time she wouldn't stop. The words didn't break. They didn't shake. They just existed, solid and undeniable. That was the thing about truth. It didn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it sat down and waited to be acknowledged. Gravel exhaled slowly through his nose. He hadn't moved closer. He hadn't reached out, but something in the room had shifted all the same. This wasn't a story about bruises anymore. It was about timing. About a boy who knew the difference between being hurt and being erased. About a question that hadn't been asked out loud but had brought him here anyway. "If I sleep here, will you wake me?" That was why today mattered. Because today he hadn't waited to find out what happened if no one did. The paper towel slid across the table without a word. It stopped just short of Ellie's hand, close enough to notice, far enough that he had to decide whether to take it. He hesitated, then wiped at the blood on his lip quickly, like he was stealing something. The red smeared instead of disappearing. A chair scraped back. The red-bearded man stood, quiet as he'd been all night. He crossed to the freezer, knelt, and came back with ice wrapped in a rag that had once been white. He held it out, not looking at the boy's face. Eli took it. His fingers were cold before the ice ever touched them. He didn't say thank you, not because he was ungrateful, but because gratitude assumed things were temporary, and he didn't know how long this moment was allowed to last. The room stayed tense, not hostile, just alert, like something had wandered in that didn't fit any known category. "We can't keep him," someone said. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't mean. It came from the far side of the table, from a man who hadn't taken his eyes off the door since the kid walked it. His voice held the weight of experience, the kind that remembered consequences long after intentions faded. "This isn't a shelter," the man went on, "and it's not safe for him or for us." No one argued right away, because he wasn't wrong. Harboring a kid meant question. Questions meant attention. Attention meant eyes where there had never been any. It meant explaining things they didn't explain. It meant dragging the world inside a room that survived by keeping it out. Gravel listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't nod. He let the words land and settle, same as he'd done with Ellie's. He pushed his chair back and stood. The room adjusted to him instinctively. Spine straightened. Voice died mid-thought. It wasn't fear that did it. It was recognition. Gravel didn't speak often. When he did, it was because something needed deciding. He looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. He didn't rush. He didn't avoid anyone either. "This isn't about keeping him," Gravel said finally. His voice was calm, but it carried. "It's about whether we're gonna send him back out." No one answered. Gravel's gaze shifted to Eli. The boy had pressed the ice to his face now, holding it there like it anchored him to something solid. "You can sit," Gravel said. Eli froze. "You can eat," Gravel continued. "There's stew on the burner." A pause, long enough to let fear breathe. "You can sleep." Ellie's shoulders sagged an inch, just enough to notice. Gravel turned back to the room. "And anyone who has a problem with that," he said evenly, "take it outside." It wasn't a challenge. It was an invitation to be honest. Boots didn't move. A man near the wall exhaled and rubbed his face. Someone else reached for a coffee mug that had gone cold. The one who'd spoken earlier stared at the table for a long moment, then gave a short nod. The choice settled into the room, heavy and unavoidable. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was about what kind of men they were going to be when no one was watching. About whether strength meant keeping doors closed or knowing when to hold one open. Eli lowered the ice. His eye was already swelling. Gravel didn't tell him where to sit. He didn't have to. The boy took the careful steps forward and chose a chair near the wall, back straight, hands folded like he was bracing for the moment someone changed their mind. No one did. Outside, a truck roared past. The clubhouse rattled and went still again. The door stayed shut, and for the first time that day, Eli wasn't listening for footsteps behind him. The skull noticed first, not all at once, not in a way anyone could point to and say this is when it changed. Just small things that stacked up quietly. Eli stopped flinching when lockers slammed shut down the hall, stopped hovering near exits during assemblies, stopped missing money. His teacher marked the difference before she understood it. He raised his hand once hesitant, like he was testing whether the room would punish him for it. When it didn't, he tried again the next day, and the next. The nurse noticed the bruises stopped multiplying. The counselor noticed he started sleeping. When the principal finally made the call protocol, paperwork, voices lowered behind closed doors, it wasn't done with suspicion. It was done with confusion. Something was happening around this kid, and no one could quite name it. The social worker scheduled a meeting for Thursday afternoon at 3:15. The parking lot filled with motorcycles, 8 of them. They rolled in slow, engines throttled low, sound controlled and deliberate. No revving, no display, just a line of chrome and matte paint easing into spaces meant for sedans and minivans. Teachers paused mid-step. Parents stopped talking. Phones came out, then hesitated, then slid back into pockets as the riders removed their helmets and clipped them to handlebars. Hands visible, movements careful. Gravel walked at the front, boots steady on asphalt. He wore a clean jacket, no cuts, no patches that invited question. The others followed his lead, spacing themselves out, not crowding, not blocking door. Inside, the air felt thinner. No shouting, no threats, just presence. The meeting room filled quickly. The social worker kept her voice even, professional, though her eyes flicked to the door more than once. Gravel answered questions without volunteering anything extra. When he didn't know something, he said so. When something wasn't his place to explain, he didn't try. Eli sat between two men who didn't touch him, didn't crowd him, but didn't leave space either. The bullies were spoken to later, not dragged into offices, not humiliated in hallways, spoken to, a calm voice, a steady gaze, words that didn't accuse but didn't bend either. By the end, the kids avoided Ellie's eyes not out of fear, but something closer to shame. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some said the bikers had threatened lawsuits. Others said they were cousin, uncle, guardians. Someone swore they'd seen a night. None of it was true, but the truth, quiet men showing up again and again, was harder to explain, and so it changed shape as it traveled. By the time court dates were scheduled, people were already whispering, "Did you hear who's showing up with the kid?" They did, every time, outside the courthouse, at follow-up meetings, at the hospital, when Eli caught the flu and refused to be alone. They stood when they needed to, sat when asked, spoke only when it mattered. The judge noticed, so did the clerk, so did the security guard who nodded at them by the third visit. The story was no longer contained by brick walls and a heavy door. It moved through hallways, parking lots, waiting room. It lived in the way people paused before making assumptions, in the way voices softened when Eli entered a room. The clubhouse didn't change, but the world around it did. That was the moment everything shifted, not with noise or force, but with consistency so steady it became impossible to look away. That was the moment the story stopped being theirs alone and started belonging to everyone who witnessed it. Change doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a clean line in the sand that separates before from after. Most days, it barely feels like anything at all. It happens in rides to school, in the low rumble of an engine idling at the curb while Eli fumbles with his backpack zipper, in the way someone always waited until he was inside before pulling away, in the same route taken every morning, not because it was fastest, but because it was familiar. It happens in spelling tests corrected with grease-stained fingers. The clubhouse table became a place for pencils as often as poker chips. Words were sounded out slowly, patiently, by men who hadn't sat in a classroom in decades, but refused to rush him. Wrong answers weren't mocked. They were circled, explained, tried again. It happens in one biker quietly choosing sobriety so he could drive. No announcement, no applause, just a decision made alone, then honored day after day. Coffee replaced the bottle. Keys were kept within reach. When asked why, he shrugged and said, "Someone's gotta be clear-headed." Eli learned how to fix a carburetor. At first, he just watched hands clasped behind his back, eyes tracking every move. Then he held tools. Then he tried. Mistakes were met with instruction, not frustration. Engines coughed and sputtered and eventually roared back to life. And Ellie's grin, when that happened, was something close to wonder. Someone else learned how to stay. That part took longer. It looked like showing up even when it was inconvenient, like sitting through meetings that dragged, like answering the same questions again without snapping, like learning how to speak to a child without barking orders or offering empty promises. No speeches, no declarations about second chances or redemption. Those words stayed unspoken because words like that asked for witnesses. This was quieter. It was jackets draped over chairs that Eli used, a toothbrush left in the bathroom that no one commented on, a bed that stayed made just in case. It was trust built in inches. Eli stopped asking where he was going to sleep, stopped counting the hours until morning. His posture changed, first shoulders loosening, head lifting. His voice followed, growing steadier, less apologetic. Setbacks came. A missed pickup once. Eli waited on the school steps longer than usual, heart racing, old fears clawing their way back in. When the bike finally pulled up, Gravel said nothing, just handed him a helmet and rode slower than usual. Another time, Eli snapped at one of them over nothing. The room went still. Instead of anger, there was space, time to cool off. An apology offered later, accepted without making it a lesson. Again and again. Seasons shifted without ceremony. Jackets got heavier, then lighter. Birthdays passed with cake bought last minute and candles found in a drawer. Report cards were taped to the fridge with the same seriousness contracts once received. Change didn't happen all at once, but one day, someone realized Eli laughed differently now, louder, freer, like he wasn't waiting for it to be taken away. And someone else realized they couldn't remember the last time the clubhouse felt empty, just showing up again and again. The courthouse smelled like old paper and floor cleaner. Eli noticed it as soon as they walked in. He always noticed things like that, small details that told him where he was and how careful he needed to be. His borrowed jacket hung off his shoulder, sleeves brushing past his knuckle. It was Gravel, altered only by a quick fold at the cuffs. The big, he liked it that way. It felt like armor. They sat in the second row, Gravel on one side, another man on the other. Space kept, but not distance. Eli swung his feet once, then stilled them, planting his boots flat on the floor like he'd practiced. He'd been quiet all morning, not withdrawn, just focused, like he was carrying something fragile and didn't want to drop it before the right moment. The judge entered and everyone stood. Eli stood too, chin lifted, hands clenched at his side. The hearing moved slowly. Names were read, dates confirmed. Words like permanency and best interest floated through the room, important but abstract. Eli followed none of it. He watched the judge's pen move across paper, watched the way Gravel's hands stayed folded, steady as stone. When the judge finally looked at him, the room seemed to shrink. "Eli," she said, voice measured, not unkind, "do you want to say anything before I make my decision?" His mouth went dry. This was the part they talked about, not rehearsed. Exactly. Gravel had told him he didn't have to speak. That silence was allowed. That nothing he said could make them leave. Eli swallowed. He glanced at Gravel. Gravel didn't nod, didn't prompt. He just met Ellie's eyes and waited. Eli turned back to the room. "I asked if they'd wake me," he said. His voice was clear, not loud. It carried. The judge paused, pen hovering. "They always did," Eli went on. He thought about mornings he hadn't slept through, about hands knocking softly on door, about someone calling his name, not shouting it, about being found every time. He took a breath. "They didn't always know how," he said, "but they showed up anyway." The words settled, unhurried. Eli smiled then, small, steady, the kind of smile that didn't ask for approval. "Turns out," he added, "that's what family is." No one moved. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full, complete. The judge cleared her throat once. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, just slightly warmer, softer around the edges. She made her ruling. Eli didn't catch every word. He didn't need to. He felt Gravel's hand rest on his shoulder, firm and real. He felt the room exhale, as if it had been holding its breath along with him. Someone behind them sniffed. Another person wiped their eyes openly, unconcerned with dignity. When it was over, when papers were signed and chairs scraped back, Eli stood in the middle of the room and realized something with a quiet jolt of surprise. He wasn't leaving alone. Gravel knelt to straighten the jacket's collar. "Still fits," he said. Eli nodded. It did. As they walked out into the daylight, the courthouse doors swinging open behind them. Eli didn't look back. He didn't need to. The promise had been kept, every word of it. On Ellie's 16th birthday, the morning light fell unevenly across the garage-turned clubhouse. The smell of oil was still there, faint now, softened by the lingering warmth of sun on concrete. A small table held a simple cake, slightly lopsided, the candles flickering as if they were testing the air. Gravel had insisted on no fuss. Just him, the men, and the boy who had grown more in these walls than anyone could measure. Eli leaned against the workbench, fingers brushing over tools that had once been foreign and frightening. He remembered the first time he had held a wrench, hands trembling, unsure if he was allowed to make a mistake. Now he moved with purpose, reaching for a screwdriver and tightening a bolt without hesitation. The muscles in his arms weren't just stronger, they belonged to him, to a life he had chosen to claim. Gravel appeared behind him, silent as always, holding something small and folded in his hands. Eli glanced up. The older man's eyes were steady, calm, but there was something heavier, there's something unspoken, that Eli had learned to recognize over the years, a weight carried for someone else. "Happy birthday," Gravel said quietly. No smiles, no theatrics. He handed Eli the package. Eli hesitated, fingers brushing the edges. The paper was thin, worn at the corners, and when he unfolded it, there was a patch. Not a club patch, not the mark of rebellion or leather, just one word stitched carefully in thread. Eli turned it over in his hands, tracing the letters with the tip of a finger. It wasn't just a gift, it was a statement, a quiet message that had taken years to deliver. He looked at Gravel, trying to read what he was supposed to feel. "You don't earn it," Gravel said. His voice carried a weight that wasn't about authority. "You keep it." Eli nodded. The simplicity of the words carried everything that mattered. He understood. He understood that some things weren't given as rewards. Some things were responsibilities. Some things were proof of presence, of showing up when it mattered, again and again. Even when no one else noticed. Outside, the sun climbed higher, painting the garage walls gold. The air smelled faintly of oil and coffee and something that felt like home. Eli folded the patch carefully and tucked it inside his jacket. He felt the weight there, solid, safe, a reminder that he belonged somewhere, that someone had believed he could, that someone would show up. He glanced around the room. The men were quiet, watching him with a kind of respect that didn't demand thanks. Over the years, they had all learned what it meant to show up, to arrive consistently, without seeking credit or applause. That lesson had shaped Eli more than any rules or lectures could have. Eli smiled, the kind of smile that came from inside him now, steady and unguarded. "Thank you," he said softly, though not for the patch alone, for the presence it symbolized, for the countless mornings, rides, and quiet lessons, for the men who had chosen to stay when it was easier to leave. Gravel just nodded, silent approval enough. He turned back toward the workbench, as if to say, "Keep going, keep showing up." Eli folded the patch back into his jacket and ran his fingers along the seam. He thought about the boy he had once been, the one who had asked if someone would wake him. If danger came, that boy would have been terrified now, but he would also have known he had arrived somewhere safe, somewhere that presence mattered more than perfection, more than rules, more than fear. What would you do if a child asked you for help? Would you walk past, or would you stay? Be someone who shows up. The lesson wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud, but it lasted longer than any speech or reward ever could. And if this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of the quiet power of presence, the strength of being there when it counts, stay with us. Show up again and again, because some gifts aren't measured in days or dollars. They are measured in the steadfastness of one person choosing to remain. Eli Eli slid the patch beneath the lining of his jacket and walked outside. The sunlight hit his face. For the first time, he didn't flinch. He was present, and so were they.